They thought America was on its knees. They thought the smoke rising over Pearl Harbor meant fear. They thought a surprise attack could break the will of a nation, built by people who had crossed oceans, fought empires, carved cities out of wilderness, and refused to bow when history demanded surrender. But on April 18, 1942, 16 American bombers rose from the deck of an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And in that moment, the world learned something the enemy had failed to understand. America could be wounded, but America would not be broken. Only a few months earlier, the United States had suffered one of the darkest mornings in its history. Pearl Harbor was not just a military attack. It was a wound carved into the American spirit. Ships burned in the harbor. Sailors were trapped beneath twisted steel. Families across the country waited for news that would change their lives forever. The Pacific Fleet had been struck hard, and across the ocean, the Japanese Empire was moving with frightening speed. Base after base, island after island, the enemy seemed unstoppable. To the world, America looked damaged. To Japan, America looked slow, unprepared, and too far away to respond. But inside the United States, something very different was happening. The shock was turning into anger. The grief was turning into resolve. And millions of Americans were asking the same question: when do we hit back?
The problem was that America was not yet fully ready for the kind of war it had been forced into. The military was still mobilizing. Factories were still transforming into engines of war. The Navy had suffered serious losses, and Japan still controlled much of the Pacific. Tokyo seemed almost untouchable, protected by distance, ocean, naval power, and the belief that no American strike could reach the heart of the Japanese Empire so soon after Pearl Harbor. The American people wanted revenge, but commanders knew the truth. Striking Japan directly was incredibly difficult. A conventional bombing mission was almost impossible. Land-based bombers could not easily reach Tokyo and return safely, and aircraft carriers were designed to launch smaller naval aircraft, not heavy army bombers. The situation seemed locked. America needed to respond, but there was no obvious way to do it.
Then came Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, a man who looked at impossibility differently from most people. Doolittle was not just a pilot. He was an engineer, a racer, an innovator, and a man built for risk. Where others saw limitations, he saw calculations. Where others saw danger, he saw a chance to change the entire emotional direction of the war. The plan that emerged was so bold, it sounded almost insane. The United States would take Army B-25 Mitchell bombers, load them onto an aircraft carrier, sail them close enough to Japan, launch them from a short carrier deck, bomb military and industrial targets, and then continue west toward China. Nothing like this had ever been done before. These aircraft were not meant for carrier takeoffs. They were large, heavy, medium bombers, built for runways, not the narrow deck of a ship moving through the Pacific. If they failed to lift off in time, they would plunge into the ocean in front of everyone watching.
16 B-25 bombers were chosen for the mission, and every unnecessary pound became important. The aircraft were modified to carry extra fuel. The crews trained for short takeoffs over and over again, pushing the limits of what those planes were expected to do. Every detail mattered. The weight of the bombs, the fuel, the equipment, the angle of takeoff, the wind over the carrier deck. Everything had to work.
there was almost no room for error. And even if the aircraft made it into the air, they would still have to fly hundreds of miles toward Japan without fighter escort. If Japanese fighters found them, they would be alone. If they were spotted too early, the mission could be ruined. If they ran out of fuel after the attack, the crews would have to crash, bail out, or land wherever they could.
The men who volunteered for the raid understood the danger. They knew there might be no clean way home. They knew they were being asked to do something that had never been attempted under those conditions. But they also knew what had happened at Pearl Harbor. They knew the country was watching, waiting, needing proof that America could strike back. These men were not simply carrying bombs. They were carrying the first American answer to the attack that had shaken the nation. In the silence before the mission, behind the technical planning and military secrecy, there was something larger at stake than target damage. There was morale. There was pride. There was the question of whether the United States could look its enemy in the eye and say, "You hit us, but you did not finish us."
On April 18, 1942, the American task force was moving through the Pacific when the mission suddenly changed. The plan had been to launch the bombers closer to Japan, giving the crews a better chance of reaching their targets and then flying on to friendly airfields in China. But before they reached the intended launch point, a Japanese patrol boat spotted the American ships. The element of surprise was in danger. Waiting any longer could expose the entire force and destroy the mission before it began. The commanders faced a brutal decision: turn back and lose the chance to strike Japan, or launch early and accept the terrifying reality that the bombers might not have enough fuel to safely reach China afterward. It was the kind of decision that history remembers, because there was no perfect answer. There was only courage.
The order was given: launch. The USS Hornet turned into the wind, and on its deck sat aircraft that had no business being there by ordinary rules of war. The first bomber was Doolittle's. Around him, sailors and airmen watched with the kind of silence that comes when everyone understands they are witnessing something that might either become a triumph or a disaster. The engines roared. The bomber began to roll forward. The carrier deck was short. The ocean was waiting. And for a few seconds, the entire plan depended on whether one heavily loaded aircraft could do the impossible. Then, just as it reached the end of the deck, Doolittle's B-25 lifted into the air. America's answer had begun.
One by one, the other bombers followed. 16 aircraft rose from the deck of the USS Hornet and headed toward Japan. No escort, no guarantee, no safe return path. Just American crews flying into enemy territory with a mission that was bigger than the bombs they carried. The psychological power of what they were doing was enormous. Japan believed its homeland was secure. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been built on surprise, distance, and confidence. But now, the United States was turning that same logic back on the enemy. Tokyo was not beyond reach. The heart of the empire was not untouchable. The ocean was no longer a shield strong enough to protect Japan from American determination. As the B-25s approached Japan, surprise worked in their favor. The Japanese had not expected American bombers to appear over their cities so soon. The raiders flew low, struck their targets, and continued west. The physical damage was limited compared to the massive bombing campaigns that would come later in the war. This was not an attack designed to destroy Japan's war machine in a single day. But in war, not every victory is measured in destroyed buildings. Some victories happen inside the minds of nations. And the message of the Doolittle Raid was devastatingly clear. The country that Japan had attacked at Pearl Harbor was already hitting back. America had crossed the Pacific, reached the enemy's homeland, and shattered the illusion that Japan was safe from retaliation.
For Americans back home, the raid became more than a military operation. It became a symbol. It told a grieving country that Pearl Harbor was not the final word. It told mothers, fathers, workers, soldiers, and sailors that their nation had not been paralyzed by fear. It told the world that the United States could improvise, adapt, and strike in ways the enemy did not expect. The raid gave Americans something they desperately needed in the early months of the war: belief. And belief matters.
But for the men in the aircraft, the danger was far from over. Because the bombers had launched earlier than planned, they had used more fuel before reaching Japan. After dropping their bombs, the crews now had to fly toward China with fuel running low, weather worsening, and darkness closing in. The mission that had already seemed dangerous now became a desperate struggle for survival. Some aircraft crash-landed, some crews bailed out, some went down near the Chinese coast. One aircraft reached the Soviet Union, where the crew was interned. Doolittle himself and his crew were forced to abandon their plane and parachute into China. In one strange and almost unbelievable detail, Doolittle landed in a pile of manure. What could have been remembered as humiliating was, to him, a blessing, because it helped break his fall. He was alive. Not every man was so fortunate. Of the 80 men who took part in the raid, many eventually made it back, but some were captured by Japanese forces. Several endured brutal captivity. 3 were executed. Others suffered terribly because of the mission. The raid became legendary, but it was not clean, easy, or painless. It came with real human cost. That is part of what makes the story powerful. These men were not actors in a myth. They were real Americans, flying real aircraft into real danger, knowing they might never see home again. Their courage did not come from certainty. It came from moving forward without certainty. James Doolittle did not immediately believe he would be celebrated. In fact, he feared the opposite. Every aircraft had been lost. The damage to Japan had been limited. Some of his men were missing or captured. From a narrow military perspective, he worried that commanders might see the mission as a failure. He even thought he might face punishment. But when he returned, he found a nation that understood what the raid had truly accomplished. America did not see failure. America saw defiance. America saw courage. America saw 16 bombers lifting off from a carrier deck and proving that the enemy had badly misjudged the American spirit. Doolittle was promoted. The raiders were honored. The mission became one of the defining moments of the early Pacific War. But its importance was not only in medals or headlines. Its importance was in what it changed. For the United States, it lifted morale at a moment when morale mattered deeply. For Japan, it exposed vulnerability
and created shock inside a leadership that had believed the homeland was protected. The raid did not end the war, but it helped change the emotional balance of the war. It showed that America was no longer only reacting. America was coming. In the months and years that followed, the Pacific War would become one of the most brutal struggles in modern history. Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, island after island, campaign after campaign. The United States would fight its way across the Pacific with a scale of industrial, military, and human effort that the enemy had not fully understood when it chose war. The Doolittle Raid was only the beginning, but beginnings matter, especially after disaster, especially after a surprise attack, especially when a nation needs to prove to itself that it still has the strength to rise.
That is why this story still carries weight. The Doolittle Raid was not the biggest bombing mission of the war. It was not the most destructive. It was not the final blow. But it was one of the clearest messages America ever sent in the early days of World War II. You can damage our ships. You can shock our people. You can strike first. But do not mistake pain for weakness. Do not mistake delay for surrender. And do not believe that the United States, once awakened, will remain still.
The men of the Doolittle Raid flew into history because their country needed more than revenge. It needed proof. Proof that distance would not protect the enemy forever. Proof that innovation could overcome impossible odds. Proof that American courage did not vanish in the smoke over Pearl Harbor. And when those 16 bombers lifted into the Pacific sky, they gave America exactly that. They gave the nation a reason to look forward again. They gave the enemy a reason to worry. And they gave history one of its most powerful reminders. A wounded America is still America. Some missions win territory. Some missions destroy armies. Some missions change maps. But a few missions change the spirit of a nation. The Doolittle Raid was one of those missions. It reminded Americans who they were. It told the world that the United States had taken the hit, absorbed the pain, and found a way to answer before anyone thought it was ready. It did not matter that the road ahead would be long. It did not matter that the war would demand more sacrifice, more loss, and more courage. What mattered in that moment was simple. America had risen.
On April 18, 1942, 16 bombers launched from the deck of an aircraft carrier and flew into uncertainty. They crossed the ocean not because victory was guaranteed, but because silence after Pearl Harbor was not an option. They carried bombs, yes, but more than that, they carried a message from a wounded nation to an enemy that believed it had seen American weakness. That message was written across the sky over Tokyo. We are still here.
And that is why the Doolittle Raid became more than an operation. It became a statement of national character. It became the moment when America showed the world that being hit is not the same as being defeated. It became the raid that turned grief into resolve, shock into action, and fear into firepower. Japan thought Pearl Harbor had broken America's spirit, but they were wrong. Pearl Harbor did not break America.
awakened it.